homeless veteran was put on trial, but the judge went silent when he heard his name. Judge Albert Grant thought he was sentencing just another homeless vagrant to 3 years in prison. But when he heard the defendant's full name during the appeal process, the gavel fell from his trembling hands. Some debts can never be repaid, and some names carry the weight of a life saved in war. The morning fog clung to the steps of the Metropolitan Courthouse like a shroud obscuring the carved words "equal justice under law" that adorned the building's facade. Inside, the machinery of justice ground forward with mechanical precision, processing cases with the efficiency of an assembly line. Courtroom 7A was scheduled for a full docket of misdemeanor cases: petty theft, public intoxication, disturbing the peace, the kind of routine proceedings that rarely drew public attention or media coverage. But today would be different. Today, the threads of fate would weave together two lives that had intersected once before in the mountains of Bosnia under circumstances that neither man would ever forget. Michael Harris shuffled into the courtroom, wearing the same clothes he'd slept in for 3 nights, running a faded military jacket that had seen better decades, worn jeans with holes at the knees, and boots held together with duct tape in determination. At 54, he carried himself with the ghost of military bearing, but homelessness had worn him down like water eroding stone. His most precious possession was the battered backpack he clutched against his chest, a canvas relic from his Army days that contained everything he owned in the world. Inside were his discharge papers, a few photographs of his unit, his father's Purple Heart, and a small American flag that had flown over his base in Bosnia. These weren't just belongings. They were the last tangible connections to a life that had once had meaning and purpose. The other people in the courtroom, lawyers in expensive suits, court officers in pressed uniforms, spectators in clean clothes, looked at Michael with a mixture of disgust and pity. To them, he was just another homeless veteran who had failed to adjust to civilian life, another burden on society who needed to be processed through the system and forgotten. Judge Albert Grant had been on the bench for 15 years, long enough to develop what he considered a realistic view of human nature. At 62, he prided himself on being tough, but fair, a jurist who didn't let emotion cloud his judgment or sentiment interfere with the law. His courtroom ran on schedule, his decisions were rarely overturned, and his reputation was built on efficiency rather than compassion. Grant had no patience for sob stories or excuses. In his view, everyone who appeared before his bench had made choices that led them there, and it was his job to impose consequences, not to solve society's problems. The case against Michael Harris seemed straightforward: assault on a security guard outside the downtown community center. According to the police report, Michael had become aggressive when asked to leave the premises, had pushed security guard Robert Chen, and had resisted arrest when officers arrived on scene. Prosecutor Ryan Owens painted a picture of a dangerous vagrant who posed a threat to public safety. "Your Honor," Owens said during his opening statement, "the defendant represents everything wrong with our city's approach to homelessness. Instead of seeking help through proper channels, he chose violence and intimidation." The prosecution's case relied heavily on Chen's testimony and the responding officers' reports. Chen described feeling threatened by Michael's presence, claimed the veteran had been drinking, and insisted that the push had been unprovoked and aggressive. The officers corroborated the story, describing Michael as combative and uncooperative during the arrest. What the prosecution didn't mention, and what Michael's overworked public defender failed to investigate, was that the security camera footage from that night had mysteriously malfunctioned, and that Chen had a history of complaints about his treatment of homeless individuals. Michael's court-appointed attorney, Jennifer Walsh, was handling 43 cases that month and had spent less than 20 minutes reviewing his file. She was a dedicated public defender, but the system's crushing caseload made thorough preparation impossible for most cases. Walsh's defense strategy was perfunctory at best. She questioned the witnesses, briefly pointed out inconsistencies in their statements, and called Michael to testify on his own behalf. But she hadn't investigated the security guard's background, hadn't sought out potential witnesses who might have seen the incident differently, and hadn't prepared Michael for the hostile cross-examination he would face. When Michael took the stand, he tried to explain what had really happened that night. He'd been waiting in line for the community center's dinner service when Chen had singled him out, demanding he leave, despite having done nothing wrong. The confrontation had escalated when Chen grabbed Michael's backpack and the assault had been nothing more than Michael trying to retrieve his belongings. But Michael's testimony was halting, confused by months of living on the streets and the trauma of his military service. He struggled to articulate his version of events, and Prosecutor Owens tore apart his credibility during cross-examination. Judge Grant listened to the testimony with the detached professionalism that had defined his career. He saw a homeless veteran whose story didn't quite add up, whose appearance and demeanor suggested someone who had given up on life and society. The evidence, while not overwhelming, seemed sufficient for a conviction. "Mr. Harris," Judge Grant said as he prepared to impose sentence, "you've been found guilty of assault and resisting arrest. The court recognizes your military service, but that doesn't excuse your behavior or give you the right to use violence when you don't get your way." Michael stood at the defendant's table, his backpack still clutched in his hands as Judge Grant continued. "I sentence you to 3 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. As the bailiff moved to take Michael into custody, the veteran made one last desperate plea. "Your Honor, please, can I keep my backpack? It has my father's Purple Heart, my discharge papers, everything that proves who I am." Judge Grant barely looked up from his paperwork. "Personal effects will be processed according to standard procedure." Bailiff removed the defendant. The gavel fell with the finality of a coffin lid closing, and Michael Harris disappeared into the prison system. Michael's adjustment to prison life was brutal, but not entirely unfamiliar. The regimentation the violence barely contained beneath the surface, the constant vigilance required for survival. It reminded him of combat zones he'd served in decades earlier. But there was one crucial difference in war: he'd had brothers beside him, and a mission that gave meaning to the suffering. In prison, he was alone with his memories and his guilt. The other inmates initially saw him as an easy target, an older man with obvious mental health issues who kept to himself and rarely spoke. But Michael's military training served him well. He could defend himself when necessary and had learned to project quiet strength that discouraged most predators. He spent his days in the prison library reading military histories and writing letters to veterans organizations, trying to get help with his case. At night, he lay on his narrow bunk and thought about the backpack that had been taken from him, the photographs of his unit, his father's Purple Heart, the small flag that had meant everything to him. Most painfully, he thought about the judge who had sentenced him, wondering if the man had any idea what it meant to strip away the last vestiges of a veteran's dignity. Judge Grant continued his daily routine processing cases with mechanical efficiency. Michael Harris had been just another defendant in a system that handled thousands of cases each year, and Grant rarely thought about individual sentences once they were imposed. But something had been nagging at him since the Harris case, a sense of incompleteness, as if he'd missed something important. The name Michael Harris seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have heard it before. It wasn't uncommon for judges to feel this way. After 15 years on the bench, the names and faces began to blur together. Grant's military service seemed like a lifetime ago. He'd been a young Army lieutenant in Bosnia during the peacekeeping mission in the 1990s, fresh out of law school, and serving his country before beginning his legal career. Those had been formative years, but he rarely spoke about them and had compartmentalized those experiences as he built his judicial career. The memories of Bosnia were filed away in a mental drawer he seldom opened. The fear, the camaraderie, the moments when life and death had hung in the balance. It was easier to focus on the present, on the law, on the comfortable routine of civilian life. 6 months into his sentence, Michael finally received help from an unexpected source. The Veterans Legal Aid Society had taken an interest in his case after receiving one of his letters, and attorney Sarah Martinez agreed to handle his appeal pro bono. Martinez was appalled by the inadequate defense Michael had received and immediately began investigating the case with the thoroughness that had been absent from his original trial. She discovered security guard Chen's history of complaints, found witnesses who contradicted the prosecution's version of events, and uncovered evidence that Prosecutor Owens had withheld potentially exculpatory information. But Martinez's most significant discovery came when she began researching Michael's military record. His service file revealed a decorated combat veteran who had served with distinction in multiple deployments, including Bosnia, where he had been awarded the Bronze Star for heroism. The citation for Michael's Bronze Star told a remarkable story. During a patrol in hostile territory, his unit had come under enemy fire. When their lieutenant was wounded and trapped in the open, Sergeant Michael Harris had crawled through enemy fire to reach him, then carried the wounded officer to safety while under continuous fire from enemy positions. The lieutenant's name was Albert Grant. When Sarah Martinez called Judge Grant's chambers to discuss the appeal, she mentioned the Bronze Star citation and asked if the judge remembered serving in Bosnia. The question hit Grant like a physical blow, and suddenly the memories came flooding back. The ambush, the pain of the bullet, wound the face of the sergeant who had risked everything to save his life. Grant's hands shook as he pulled out his old military records and found the after-action report from that day in 1995. There it was in black and white. Sergeant Michael Harris displayed extraordinary courage under fire, crawling approximately 50 meters through enemy positions to reach this officer and carry him to safety. His actions undoubtedly saved my life. The report was signed by Second Lieutenant Albert Grant. Judge Grant stared at the document for a long time, remembering the weight of the sergeant's arms as he'd carried him to safety, the calm voice that had told him everything would be okay, the face that had been the last thing he'd seen before losing consciousness from blood loss. That same man, his savior, was sitting in a prison cell because of a sentence Grant had imposed without recognizing him, without understanding who he was dealing with, without showing the compassion that Michael Harris had shown him 30 years earlier. Judge Grant sat in his chambers that evening, staring at the Bronze Star citation and the after-action report, unable to reconcile the hero described in those documents with the broken homeless man he had sentenced to 3 years in prison. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical burden, making it difficult to breathe. He remembered every detail of that day in Bosnia, now the crack of sniper fire, the burning pain in his leg, the certainty that he was going to die alone in that hostile landscape. And then Michael Harris had appeared crawling through the dirt and bullets, his face grim with determination as he reached Grant's position. "I've got you, Lieutenant," Michael had said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You're going home." Michael had lifted Grant onto his back and carried him 200 meters to safety, moving from cover to cover, while enemy bullets whistled overhead. He'd stayed with Grant until the medics arrived, holding pressure on the wound and talking to him to keep him conscious. Grant had tried to find Michael after his recovery, wanting to thank him properly, but their unit had been reassigned and they'd lost touch. Over the years, Grant had often wondered what had happened to the sergeant who had saved his life, imagining him living a successful civilian life. Maybe with a family, certainly with the recognition he deserved. Instead, Michael Harris had become homeless, forgotten by the system he had served, and ultimately sentenced to prison by the very man whose life he had saved. Unable to sleep, Judge Grant spent the night reviewing every aspect of Michael's case. What he found made his stomach turn with disgust, not at Michael, but at the system that had failed him so completely. Prosecutor Ryan Owens had built his case on the testimony of a security guard with multiple complaints against him for harassment of homeless individuals. The police officers who had arrested Michael had written reports that were suspiciously similar, suggesting coordination rather than independent observation. Most damning of all, the security camera footage that might have exonerated Michael had been accidentally erased before the defense could review it. Grant called an emergency meeting with the court administrator and demanded a full review of the case. He also contacted the State Bar Association to file a complaint against Prosecutor Owens for potential prosecutorial misconduct. But the legal remedies, while necessary, felt inadequate compared to the magnitude of the injustice. Michael Harris had saved Grant's life in Bosnia, and Grant had repaid that debt by sending him to prison based on fabricated evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. The irony was devastating. Michael had risked his life to save a young lieutenant who would grow up to become a judge, and that judge had failed to recognize the hero standing before him, had seen only a homeless vagrant worthy of contempt rather than the decorated veteran who deserved honor. Grant realized that his entire judicial philosophy, his emphasis on efficiency over compassion, his belief that everyone who appeared before his bench deserved whatever consequences they received, had blinded him to the humanity of the people he was supposed to serve. Word of the connection between Judge Grant and Michael Harris leaked to the media within days of Grant's internal investigation. The story had everything that guaranteed national attention: a war hero wrongly imprisoned a judge discovering he had sentenced the man who saved his life, and a system of justice that had failed catastrophically. Veterans organizations picked up the story and began demanding Michael's immediate release. Legal experts debated the ethical implications of a judge discovering such a personal connection to a defendant after sentencing. Civil rights groups used the case to highlight the broader problem of how the justice system treated homeless veterans. The media coverage was intense and largely sympathetic to Michael, but it also put enormous pressure on Judge Grant to take action. Editorial writers called for Michael's immediate release, while legal commentators questioned whether Grant should recuse himself from any further proceedings. Grant knew that whatever he did next would be scrutinized by the entire legal community and the public at large. But more importantly, he knew that he had a moral obligation to right the wrong he had committed, regardless of the personal and professional consequences. The question was whether the legal system would allow him to correct his mistake, or whether bureaucratic procedures would prevent him from delivering the justice that Michael Harris deserved. Judge Grant worked with Sarah Martinez to develop a legal strategy that would not only free Michael Harris but also expose the prosecutorial misconduct that had led to his wrongful conviction. The process was complicated by the fact that Grant couldn't simply overturn his own sentence without proper legal grounds. The system had procedures that had to be followed even when correcting obvious injustices. Martinez filed a motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, and ineffective assistance of counsel. She also requested an expedited hearing, arguing that Michael's continued imprisonment constituted an ongoing violation of his civil rights. Grant recused himself from hearing the motion, knowing that his personal connection to Michael would create an appearance of impropriety. But he also filed an unprecedented judicial statement acknowledging his error and supporting Michael's appeal. "I have reviewed this case extensively," Grant wrote, "and I am convinced that a grave injustice has occurred. The defendant, Michael Harris, is a decorated combat veteran who served his country with distinction. The evidence suggests that he was wrongfully convicted based on fabricated testimony and prosecutorial misconduct. I urge the appellate court to grant his motion for immediate release." The hearing on Michael's motion was held before Judge Patricia Williams, a respected jurist known for her fairness and attention to detail. The courtroom was packed with veterans, legal observers, and media representatives, all drawn by the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Sarah Martinez presented a devastating case against the original conviction, methodically dismantling every piece of evidence that had been used to convict Michael. She showed that security guard Chen had lied about the incident, that the police officers had coordinated their testimony, and that prosecutor Owens had withheld evidence that would have exonerated Michael. Most powerfully, she read Judge Grant's Bronze Star citation aloud in court, describing how Michael had risked his life to save a wounded officer in Bosnia. "That officer," Martinez said, looking directly at the packed gallery, "was Albert Grant, the judge who sentenced Mr. Harris to 3 years in prison without recognizing the man who had saved his life." Prosecutor Ryan Owens attempted to defend his handling of the case, but his arguments crumbled under scrutiny. The evidence of prosecutorial misconduct was overwhelming. He had failed to disclose exculpatory evidence, had coached witnesses to change their testimony, and had knowingly presented false evidence to the court. Judge Williams was scathing in her assessment of Owens' conduct. "The prosecutor's behavior in this case represents a fundamental violation of his oath and his duty to seek justice rather than merely convictions," she said. "Mr. Owens has not only wrongfully convicted an innocent man, but he has done so to a decorated war hero who deserved the protection of the law, not its persecution." Owens was immediately suspended from the district attorney's office pending a full investigation. He would later face disbarment proceedings and criminal charges for his role in Michael's wrongful conviction. Judge Williams didn't hesitate in her ruling. "The motion for a new trial is granted," she announced. "Furthermore, given the overwhelming evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and the complete lack of credible evidence supporting the original conviction, I am dismissing all charges against Michael Harris with prejudice." The courtroom erupted in applause as Michael, who had been brought from prison for the hearing, sat in stunned silence. After 18 months of incarceration, he was finally free, but the experience had left him changed. The confident sergeant who had saved lives in Bosnia had been replaced by a broken man who struggled to believe that justice was possible. Judge Williams continued, "Mr. Harris, on behalf of the judicial system that failed you so catastrophically, I offer my deepest apologies. Your service to this country has been repaid with injustice, and that is a stain on all of us who serve in the legal profession. She ordered Michael's immediate release and the return of all his personal property, including the backpack that had been taken from him during his original sentencing. Most importantly, she ordered the state to provide Michael with housing, health care, and legal support to help him rebuild his life. As Michael walked out of the courtroom, a free man, Judge Grant, was waiting for him in the hallway. The two men looked at each other for a long moment, the judge who had failed to recognize his savior and the veteran who had been betrayed by the system he had served. "Sergeant Harris," Grant said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I don't know how to apologize for what I did to you. You saved my life in Bosnia, and I repaid that debt by sending you to prison. I failed you, and I failed the principles of justice I swore to uphold." Michael looked at the judge, older now, grayer, but still recognizable as the young lieutenant he had carried to safety 30 years earlier. "Judge Grant," he said quietly, "I didn't save your life in Bosnia so you would owe me something. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And what you're doing now, admitting your mistake, trying to make it right, that's the right thing to do too." The reunion between Judge Grant and Michael Harris became a symbol of redemption and the possibility of justice even in the face of systemic failure. Grant used his influence to ensure that Michael received not just his freedom, but the support he needed to rebuild his life. Michael was provided with permanent housing, comprehensive health care, including treatment for PTSD, and legal assistance to pursue compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. More importantly, he was finally recognized for his military service, receiving the honors and respect that had been denied to him for too long. The backpack that had been taken from him was returned with all its contents intact: his father's Purple Heart, his discharge papers, the photographs of his unit, and the small American flag that had flown over his base in Bosnia. These weren't just possessions, they were the restoration of his identity and dignity. Michael Harris's exoneration sent shockwaves through the legal community and sparked a nationwide conversation about the treatment of homeless veterans in the justice system. Prosecutor Ryan Owens was disbarred and faced criminal charges for his misconduct, while the police officers who had fabricated evidence were suspended and investigated. Judge Grant took an unprecedented step by publicly apologizing to Michael and announcing reforms to his courtroom procedures, including mandatory review of cases involving veterans and enhanced training for court personnel on military culture and PTSD. The state legislature passed the Michael Harris Act, requiring prosecutors to undergo additional training on veteran issues and establishing an ombudsman to investigate claims of prosecutorial misconduct in cases involving former service members. Michael's story became a rallying cry for veterans' rights organizations, who used his case to advocate for better legal representation for homeless veterans and increased funding for programs addressing veteran homelessness and mental health issues. The case prompted a comprehensive review of how the justice system handles cases involving veterans, particularly those suffering from PTSD or homelessness. Law schools began incorporating veteran advocacy into their curricula, and public defender offices received additional funding to hire attorneys with specialized training in military issues. Judge Grant became an advocate for judicial reform, speaking at conferences about the importance of seeing defendants as human beings rather than case numbers. His transformation from a judge focused on efficiency to one emphasizing compassion became a model for judicial education programs. The Veterans Legal Aid Society, which had taken Michael's case, saw a surge in funding and support, allowing them to help hundreds of other veterans who had been failed by the system. Michael's case became a template for identifying and correcting similar injustices. Security companies began implementing new training programs for guards dealing with homeless populations, and community centers revised their policies to ensure that veterans were treated with dignity and respect. Michael Harris used his newfound freedom and resources to help other homeless veterans, becoming an advocate for those who had been forgotten by society. He worked with the Veterans Legal Aid Society to identify other cases of potential injustice and spoke at events about the importance of recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Judge Grant and Michael developed an unlikely friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how justice could fail and how it could be restored. Their story became a testament to the power of recognition, redemption, and the idea that it's never too late to do the right thing. Michael's final words to the media captured the essence of his experience. Gratitude can save a lost soul, but justice is what saves a society.